Welcome to Planetary Calendar's Astrology Portraits. I'm Lahni DeAmicis, one of the astrologers. The portrait we chose for today is of Sean Connery, the very famous actor who is most well known for his work as the originating actor in James Bond, who of course was followed by many other actors. He was born August 25th, 1930, a Monday at 6:05 p.m. in Edinburgh, Scotland. Now, it's a fascinating chart, partly because, like many people who live their life out in the public eye, so much of the chart is above the horizon. Jupiter, Pluto, Ceres, the Sun, Neptune, the Moon, Mercury, and Venus were all overhead when he was born. And Saturn was rising. So he has the Sun in Virgo at 1 degree Virgo. So it means it was very, very close to the royal star Regulus, which is known for making personalities very bright. He has Capricorn rising, has Saturn, the ruling sign, the ruling planet of Capricorn, right there. So Saturn in Capricorn at the rising, that is the classic tall, dark, and handsome man. That's the epitome of that. He has the Moon, Virgo, but all the way at the end of the sign at 23 degrees Virgo, conjunct Vesta. And Vesta tends to make things even brighter, and also conjunct Mercury in Virgo in rulership. So he has this little cluster of the Moon, Vesta, and Mercury together in Virgo. The Sun all the way at the beginning of the sign in Virgo, conjunct Neptune. And when planets are conjunct Neptune, it tends to make them more successful. It adds a lot of imagination to it. So there's a lot of qualities here that you would expect to see in someone who was, a movie star. And he did most of his work in the movies. Early on, of course, he was on the stage in England. But later on, most of his work was in the movies. And this is very different from some actors. You have some actors who go back and forth between the stage and television and screen. He was very much a movie star. He has Venus in Libra, highly elevated in the chart. So the Venus in Libra is in rulership, and it's up in the 10th house, the house of career. What's really interesting when you look back at his early career, he was known for being just gorgeous, just a gorgeous man. This is how he was described. On top of that, he has the Sun and Moon in the 9th house. It's a house that is about being athletic, and he was a very physically athletic man. And having really, 5 planets or 4 planets in an asteroid in Virgo in the 9th house, you'd expect him to be someone who had a rugged sense to him, that liked being outdoors, and this was very true of him. Of course, one of the ways was probably golf, but he started off in the Navy. And in fact, later on, when he played the role of an actor, acted in roles about being in the Navy, he oftentimes he did it so well because he had served, as a sailor. Now, interestingly, when you look at the Astro Cartography of his chart, this gets really interesting. When you look at that, and this is why we're looking at his chart especially, besides the fact he just passed recently and we feel that it's appropriate. He was a very well-known actor. You start seeing the connections, okay? Where he was born, he had Saturn rising. So he has a Saturn ascending line crossing over England. So it talks about, kind of a tough start. He grew, his father, worked as a truck driver, and his mother, I think, cleaned houses. He didn't come from a wealthy family at all. He came from a working class family. He also had a Mars descending line there. And that's interesting when you look at his chart. One of the things he was really very good at, he has Jupiter and Pluto and Pallas Athena in the 7th house. That's the house of partnership. He was very good at making good friends, lifelong friends. And he had many actors who became close with in his career who were lifelong friends who he acted with in multiple films. But they were also people who many times said, I got the perfect guy for you in this movie, my friend Sean. That happened a lot for him. What's interesting, he started out in bodybuilding and he did very well, but he actually said he left it because the Americans kept beating them because they would put more muscle on it. The reason they would put more muscle on it is they wouldn't do any other sports, and doing other sports would tend to, stretch the muscles out. And he liked doing other sports. In fact, he was actually offered a career as a footballer. What we in the United States we call soccer. He was offered a professional career doing that. The reason he didn't do that was he realized that he was 22 at the time. Most footballers were finished by the time they were 30, but he was also acting at the time. He realized that at 30, he would just be rolling along as an actor. So he'd have a much longer career, which you expect from someone who has Capricorn rising and Saturn there saying, what's my long-term goal, right? What's my long-term goal? I mean, this was a very practical guy. But this thing about the lines, like I said, let me get back up to the lines. When you look at the lines, he has Saturn passing over the rising. He has Mars descending there. And he also has a Chiron IC line there. Chiron is about learning. The IC line is where you feel at home. He actually suffered from horrible, I believe it was hiatal hernia. And he was discharged from the Navy because of it. And apparently it was hereditary. Many of the men in his family had the same problem. So he was discharged from the Navy after being in there for a while because of this. So he had suffered the pain that comes with Chiron. Chiron oftentimes relates to, an illness or a disease. And Chiron at the IC means it runs through your family. But that's not really where he made his money. I mean, he first became well known there. But where did he make his money? He made his money through Hollywood. And he especially got his start through the Broccolis. They were the producers of the James Bond movies, starting with the first one. Where was Broccoli from? He was from New York City, right? Where is Sean Connery's major lines over New York? Right over New York City is his Sun MC line, the flag above his castle, the brightest light in his chart, conjunct Neptune, who amplifies success. So people from New York City were going to amplify his success. We're going to recognize his success. But that's not where the broccoli works. That's where broccoli was from, but that's not where they worked. Where they worked, of course, was Hollywood. Of course. What's over Hollywood for Mr. Connery? It's his Venus ascending line. It's the place where he feels the most indulged and the most loved. And because it's in Libra, the ruling sign, it's the place where he's best able to make partnerships. And the thing that's funny is he made partnerships not only with the Broccolis, because he did a bunch of movies with them, but even Ian Fleming, who was the author of the Connery books, originally didn't like him. They didn't want him for the role because he said that he seemed too much like, a big man star. He was 6'2", 6'3" tall. He was a big man. And he wanted someone who was more spy-like, who would blend in more. But it was Mrs. Broccoli who sold them on it. She thought that he was just perfect for it. She became his advocate. And he's so convinced Ian Fleming of how good he was at the role, especially after the first movie, that later Ian Fleming wove some of Sean Connery's family history into the backstory for James Bond. That's how much they kind of became part of the same family, kind of married into the family in a certain way, which is what a seventh house does. It shows where you marry into the family. So he had Venus ascending there, right? Right off the coast, he had the Jupiter midheaven line, which means expansion and going global. Remember, this is a global phenomena. He had the Uranus descending line. Uranus makes things exciting. He has Pluto, the Pluto MC line running through there, which also has a globalization quality to it and adds a huge amount of sexuality to it. When Pluto shows up, it's about the power of the small. Well, the power of the small has to do with things like genetics, right? About sexuality, the power of the hidden. So he has this whole group of planets going through here. Pluto, and also Pallas Athena, which meant that his skill set really came to fore there. I mean, his skills were really refined there as an actor. What's funny is that a lot of it was filmed internationally, and a lot of it was actually filmed in England, but it was all run from Hollywood. So when he would go to Hollywood for the preparations and such, they just loved him. Then he'd go back to England, back to his Saturn line, and he would just work really, really, really hard on the project. So it just shows how these lines can connect people together to places that you wouldn't expect. This young boy who grows up in Scotland is really mentored and fawned upon by this couple who's from New York City, who then engage him for their company in Los Angeles, who then sends him back to England to do the filming. It's just remarkable. It's just remarkable. So when we look at the chart, and that's really what I wanted to point out, that was the whole purpose of this one, was to look at the planetary lines, because it was such a good story. But I do have to point out one other thing about his chart. One of the things that made his James Bond, and many of the roles that he did, fun, was his sense of impishness. Even when he was playing the crusty old man, he always still had this sense of impishness to him. It was the Mars in Gemini. And the Mars in Gemini is square his moon and his Mercury. So while that Mercury-Mars square, they just can't help but want to get into it. You know, Mercury and Mars, they're the pawns on the chessboard. They're the ones who want to be out there in the lead. And they want to get into it. And he couldn't help but want to engage people and play with them and be, a bit of a rascal. And it really showed up in his acting and such. But he really was really built for this kind of work, this ability to create an image, the Sun conjunct Neptune, the Moon conjunct Vesta and Mercury, the ability to communicate and be flexible. Mercury and Virgo are very good about being flexible. The director says, do that. And they say, okay. And they put themselves aside for the sake of the work. The Vesta showed his dedication to it. Once he started working on it, he was dedicated to it. And of course, the Venus in Libra, highly elevated. He was just a gorgeous man. He stayed good looking really his entire life. So that's the story of Sean Connery, a remarkable artist. And Scotland considers him one of their national treasures. So come back and see us again on Fridays for the forecast. Come see us on Tuesdays for our portraits. Visit planetarycalendar.com to get your calendars, because after all, you're going to want to know what's going on. You don't want to be, left out of the loop. And please visit our YouTube channel, Planetary Calendar Astrology, and subscribe, because it's a big help to us in getting these forecasts and portraits to you. Thanks for joining us.